Is mental illness a biological condition? And has that assumption paved a path that, despite good intentions, has often resulted in failed treatments and worse? Those are the questions that animate Anne Harrington's new book. It's called Mind Fixers: Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness. She is a professor of the history of science at Harvard University, and Anne Harrington joins us now. Thanks for making the trip up from Cambridge.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Good to have you here. How well, in your view, does medicine today understand the causes of mental illness?
Not really well.
Really?
Not really well. And that's the whole point of writing a history, to help people understand both why certain kinds of claims are made and the gap between rhetoric and reality. The truth is that there's not a single mental illness for which we have a coherent biological explanation.
Well, let me try this. We hear frequently that mental illness happens as a result of a chemical imbalance in the brain.
Right.
How accurate is that characterization?
Well, these were ideas that were developed in the 1950s based on animal experiments that involved giving a drug to a rat or a mouse, and that caused the mouse to become kind of immobile and was seen as a kind of a animal model of depression. And then it was found that when you give these mice or rodents antidepressants, that they perk up and that the norepinephrine and serotonin levels rise. So the question is this animal model of depression an accurate or interesting or valid model for understanding human depression? The fact that antidepressants don't work on everyone, or that different antidepressants work for some people and others and then don't work on others, suggests that it's not simply a matter of putting the thing into the fuel tank and filling up the gas. Most thoughtful neuroscientists, pharmacologists, psychopharmacologists believe that the chemical imbalance theory is at best very imperfect, very partial, and that depression is probably a sort of cluster of different disorders that have a series of complex, not just biological, but also psychosocial causes.
Well, take us through the history then. At what point in medical history did doctors, clinicians, researchers, and so on start to look at mental illness as a biological problem?
Well, how far back do you want me to go? And let's do the modern story.
Sure.
But by the modern story, I think the best place to start is the mid-19th century. Because one of the things that's really interesting about psychiatry is that it actually came into the world as a profession that was betting on its ability to cure mental illness, not biologically, but through educational measures, through psychosocial measures. It came into the world betting on the proposition that if it put people into an institution that at that time was called a mental asylum, but that later comes to be called a mental hospital, that just putting people into those institutions would be good medicine, that requiring them to submit to the regimes of these hospitals would be good medicine, and that's how you cure. And they were actually challenging older quasi-biological, quasi-medical understanding of mental illness that were much more fatalistic about the prospects of the mentally ill. So they come into the world betting on the institutions, betting on their ability to mold behavior back along more rational measures. And it doesn't really work well. By the 1880s or so, it becomes clear not only that people don't seem to be getting better, but that the numbers of mentally ill are increasing. And this is actually the stimulus for a efflorescence of new interest in biological understandings of mental illness, because if they're not curing people, then it must be that these people have some kind of a biological defect. And at this point in time, this goes hand in hand with a certain kind of fatalistic way of thinking about mental illness. They're not getting better, but it's not our fault. They have a biological defect. And most of the people that were assumed to have a biological defect were also assumed to have an inherited biological defect. So this then opens the door to a whole sort of strand of the story that leads to calls to isolate the mentally ill, so that not just to now treat them, but to ensure that they can't reproduce. Ultimately, it leads to new laws to sterilize the institutionalized mentally ill. Ultimately, at some point, it does lead to the much more drastic kinds of stories that we associate with the Nazis. So this is a strand.
Ruthless eugenics, in other words.
It's not the only part of the story. But that's one strand of the troubled history of psychiatry's efforts to nail down the biology of mental illness.
Well, back in the day, they might have called it melancholy. Is that what we call depression today?
Well, so again, back in the depths of time, we know all sorts of different ways of being mentally ill. Hundreds of ways of being mentally ill. Back in the sort of early 19th century, there were basically two ways of being mentally ill. You were either manic or you were melancholic. But both of these were quite expansive categories and could cover a lot of the waterfront. Melancholy, therefore, was bigger than depression. But it was associated with often a inability to move forward with your plans, a kind of withdrawal into sort of states of despair. It had a certain kind of sometimes a kind of glamorous air to it because it was associated with people who studied too much, people who anguished over religious issues. It was associated with men more than women. None of these things are true anymore. Now it's more associated with women than with men, and it's not particularly glamorous, and so on.
I do want to pick up on the gender angle because a lot of the stories in your book involve diagnosing women.
Yes.
And there is this trope about the anxious housewife who, is all fussed and furious about a bunch of different things, and lots of drugs have been used to target these women. Why was that?
So why were women targeted by psychiatry? For two reasons. One is that they probably sought help more frequently than men. And they were also seen by psychiatrists as a greater problem than men. And the reason they were a greater problem is not only that they were distressed in themselves, but their distress might affect their children. And there was a tremendous concern in the 1950s and 60s with the impact of bad mothers on the mental well-being, the mental health of their offspring. And so if mom isn't doing okay, if mom is depressed, if mom is anxious, then the whole family suffers. And this was part of a larger kind of a discussion at the time about problems with the family more broadly, gender trouble between men and women. Women are discontented. They haven't gone happily back to the home in the wake of after World War II, and so on.
When did that go out of vogue, that approach or that theory?
The bad mother?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't go out of vogue it was not a single moment. It went out of vogue at different times depending on the disorder. And it went out of vogue in an important way because parents finally organized, got angry, and became activists. So one of the most important, actually, stories in the history of the biological turn in psychiatry has to do with the role that angry parents, and particularly angry and desperate mothers of adult schizophrenic children, played in turning the tide towards biology, because they had been blamed for causing schizophrenia in their offspring by the same leadership that also had begun to downsize the mental hospitals that previously had looked after these offspring. These offspring were supposed to go into the community and be looked after, but these community mental health centers were not really built at the levels that they were promised. So they ended back in their family home. And now they found not only that, where there was very little resources for them. So the families are trying to look after their adult children. Psychiatry seemed to have very little interest in helping them. And this was the same profession that had previously blamed them, now that they were caring for these children, blamed them for causing the illness in the first place. So they organize, they call psychiatry out, and they make alliances with a previously marginalized group of biological psychiatrists who tell them, this is not your fault. Your child suffers from a brain disorder, and no, we don't quite know what, but we don't know the details. But it's not your fault. It's a brain disease, and what you should be doing is you should be advocating the government and the profession to do more research into the biology of mental illness. And so they do. They're as responsible as anything else for the medicalization of schizophrenia. So that's one story. There's another story that we don't need to go all of them around autism. For which parents were also blamed, and the broad kind of effort to push back against sort of the bad mothers plays a lot. The feminists in the 1960s and 70s play an important role. So there's multiple stories always in action here.
That's gender. What about race?
So psychiatry's biological understandings of mental illness have been inflected through the lens of racial stigma, racial discrimination, and also through the Jim Crow law structures of that go right up through the 1950s and beyond. So one really interesting point where race and the biological turn inflects is again around schizophrenia. In the 1950s and 60s, the typical schizophrenic was white, passive, confused, and often a woman. By the late 1960s, when we're in the heat of the civil rights movement, the typical schizophrenic was paranoid, angry, violent, and black, and male.
And male, yes.
And male. And this goes arm in arm with new understandings about schizophrenia as a cause by excess dopamine. It's influenced by the abuse of amphetamines in the 1960s. The so-called speed freak becomes the model of the new kind of schizophrenic. And that then gets applied to this new kind of demographic in ways that end up targeting and disproportionately diagnosing certain populations.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how this, the medical community we depend on so desperately, and yet they've been very wrong not all that long ago on some of these very important things.
Well, they've been part of the same history that all of us have been part of. And so a lot of us were very wrong about a lot of things. You could talk about, the story of race and biological psychiatry. You could talk about the story of homosexuality and biological sex. So I think that what the real message is that psychiatry, and in this case we're focused on biological psychiatry, it tracks and is embedded in the larger histories that more generally, and I've been focusing largely on the U.S. context, that more generally shape the making of modern American society.
How long ago was it that the medical community finally determined that homosexuality was not a mental illness or such?
Let me rephrase the question because it didn't determine it exactly. It agreed to take homosexuality out of its diagnostic manual in 1973.
That's the Bible, the DSM.
Yes, the so-called Bible, which is in crisis, but we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. But yes, this was, that was in 1973. But the prologue to that moment is a story about the activist efforts of the gay community. That really the people point to the Stonewall Inn riots as a kind of a moment when the gay community
in New York City.
In New York City, I'm sorry. But one of the the Stonewall Inn riots happened because the Stonewall Inn was a kind of a pub where people would go, and
I think it was 50 years ago this year, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It was. So it's a good moment to be kind of shouting out to it. On this particular night, the police would frequently raid it on some or another pretext. On this particular night, people fought back. They were sick and tired of basically being penalized and punished for their lifestyles. And one of the things that they said is that our quarrel is not just with the police, our quarrel is with the psychiatrists. And it's with the psychiatrists because the psychiatrists had made very clear their belief that homosexuality was an illness, was a form of deviance, was a perversion, and had dedicated a fair amount of resources to curing people of homosexuality. So what happens is that they take their arguments to the meetings of the American Psychiatric Association. They go there in 1970, they picket. At one point, they break into a meeting of psychiatrists who are discussing the use of aversive therapy, using electrical shocks to cure people of responses to homoerotic material. And they break it up, and there's like a huge, they call the police. It's a huge kerfuffle. But then they say, look, you've got to start talking to us. And a key moment happens when they hold, the next year, 1971, when they hold a session called, I think it was called Psychiatry, Friend or Foe of Homosexuals. And they agree that there should be a psychiatrist, a homosexual psychiatrist, that should speak on the panel if one could be found. And they find one. He only agrees to speak if he can wear a mask, a wig, and a voice-altering microphone so that no one can identify him, because it would have incredible implications. He could be fired. I mean, the ways that the effects people forget because,
It's a long time ago.
it's sort of a long time ago, but there's still people who remember.
Yeah.
He could have lost his job and worse. So he calls himself Dr. H. Anonymous. And he gives this incredibly moving speech where he pleads with his colleagues to stop trying to figure out who he is and listen to him, and talks about how he's one of 100 in the APA. He says, kind of flippantly, we call ourselves the Gay PA. We know who we are. You don't know who we are. But we live among you, and we're as healthy and committed to the mission of mental health as all of you. And he pleads for them to have some compassion for this little piece of humanity called homosexuality, and he gets a standing ovation. And you can't really go back after that. And so there's then a process by which a man named Robert Spitzer, who ends up being quite important in the revision of the DSM, about a decade later, is brought in to resolve the issue. And one thing leads to another, and they decide to take it out of the DSM. There's by vote. They vote.
And what year is this?
This is 1973. The board of trustees first votes, but the psychoanalysts are not happy about this. And one of the things to say is that even though the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, votes homosexuality out of the DSM in 1973, the Psychoanalytic Association feels that it's simply co-opted to the politics of the time, and it holds its ground and continues to practice what now is sort of what's called like conversion therapy, right into the 1990s, and in some cases beyond. In 1991, the American Psychoanalytic Association finally comes on board. 1991.
That's not that long ago.
That's not, and actually last June, just last June, the American Psychoanalytic Association apologized. Just last June. So, for its role in causing harm over the decades.
Before the camera started rolling here, you and I had a little joke about the fact that we were probably at some point going to talk about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and here's that moment.
All right.
Because I want to do an excerpt from your book here about ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, which of course is more popularly known as electroshock therapy, even though that's a very bad way to actually describe what goes on. And here's how you refer to it in your book. One popular idea was that ECT worked by satisfying patients' masochistic desires for punishment from a father figure, the physician. Another was that the treatment produced states of regression, which gave patients conscious access to infantile wishes and fears, which could then be explored in therapy. Still another was that the treatment regressed patients to a childlike state, giving them an opportunity to rebuild their personalities. And I guess my question is, patients bought this?
Did patients know these were the theories?
They didn't know.
I don't think so. But I think in terms of those theories, you need to understand that ECT came of age and became widely used during the heyday of psychoanalysis. One of the kind of myths, historical myths that I'm hoping to push back against in Mind Fixers is that we had this Freudian era, and then we threw out the Freudian dinosaurs, and then we all became biological, and things got much better. In fact, some of the most, the treatments that the biological psychiatrists are using in the 80s, 90s, and beyond all existed in the heyday of the Freudians. ECT, all the drugs, and so on. So the psychoanalysts see the usefulness of ECT, particularly in hospital populations, which they don't really deal with. But they frame it within, they provide a framing for it that makes sense in terms of their theoretical orientations.
Cuckoo's Nest is, I'm thinking, about 45 years old now. How much damage do you think that did to the public's understanding of the possibilities of ECT?
Huge, huge. But not just ECT, about the mental hospital, about lobotomy. Lobotomy, I know I'm not standing here to defend lobotomy at all there, but...
Nurse Ratched?
But it sort of presented a kind of ghoulish, gothic understanding of psychiatry and the mental hospital and its treatments that I think cast a very long shadow forward. ECT has had a kind of a renaissance, a comeback, and I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not here to say whether it's a good treatment or not good treatment, but I do know psychiatrists who say it has its place.
Do you know why it works?
No, nobody does. I actually recently checked in the most recent review article of why is ECT work, from 2017 that I found, and there was something like 30 different theories. So there's a lot of data There's a lot of, but they don't all go in the same direction. And this is true of a lot of research in biological psychiatry. It isn't that people aren't working hard. It isn't that they don't produce interesting data. It's that it's very hard for things, it's proved very hard for things to come together into a coherent story that, say, medicine can use when it talks about an infectious disease. We kind of have a coherent story about why people get a particular infectious disease. That hasn't proved so easy for biological psychiatry.
Okay, we have a coherent story, but you also say in the book that medicine is not particularly humble when it comes to acknowledging that a lot of the time, they don't know why stuff works. They don't know why certain meds work with some and don't work with others, or why ECT might work with some or not with others. Does medicine need to be a little more humble about this?
That's one of the sort of suggestions. I'm not trying to, I'm an historian, and it's my job, I think, to sort of help people understand why we're in the world that we are. But there is a kind of, having taken the long journey with me, people might be interested in saying, so, Professor Harrington, what do you think we should do? And one of the things that I see as a pattern that has generally not done psychiatry much good is hubris. And it wasn't just the biological psychiatrists that were hubristic. The Freudians were hubristic, and it's one of the reasons they got into such trouble and ended up being pushed out in the 1980s by the biological psychiatrists. The problem is the biological psychiatrists come in and kind of take on the same stance that they're now going to be in charge of the entire waterfront. I think we're at an inflection point. I think the same kind of arrogance and overpromising that got the Freudians in such trouble in the 1970s and early 80s is now nipping at the heels of biological psychiatry.
And do you see any evidence that they're starting to bevel their edges a little bit and be less doctrinaire about their role in all of this?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I'm hoping that conversations like these can play a teeny role in kind of getting them to talk more honestly about where things are. Right after I finish this interview with you, I'm going to go talk to some psychiatric residents about some of the ideas in the book, and the fact that I'm being invited to speak at a grand rounds to psychiatric residents, I think is very positive.
This is at Sunnybrook Medical Center.
That's right, just a mile from here. So I've been quite impressed and even somewhat moved by the positive feedback from psychiatrists. It was very important to me that mind fixers that I'm fair. And that what the critiques that I make are in the service of making a profession that I actually think does hugely important work, but deserves better. Making those critiques so that in a constructive way that can be heard and allow people to move forward. There's a reason why there's such distrust of psychiatry. But simply sort of pushing it away or simply sort of amplifying the distrust won't move anything forward.
I want you to tell us a story here, okay? This is from the book, The Woman Who Takes Antidepressants, and the doctor says it's a cosmetic personality-enhancing drug. What happens?
All right, let me.
You want to set it up?
So this is a story about antidepressants, and it's a story about an antidepressant that was originally not seen as a very big deal. The previous sort of generations of antidepressants tended to target norepinephrine preferentially, or sometimes targeted norepinephrine and serotonin. This new antidepressant targeted serotonin exclusively. It comes to be known as an SSRI. And one of the original motivations for creating this antidepressant is the hope that it would be safer than the so-called tricyclic antidepressants that had been dominant previously, because it would put less strain on the heart. So Eli Lilly didn't have didn't think it was going to be such a big, seller, but to its surprise, it became quite a big seller because of the perception that it was safer. So people began prescribing it preferentially, and it's called Prozac. Prozac's doing really well, and then in 1993, a psychiatrist named Peter Kramer comes out with a book called Listening to Prozac, in which he warns his colleagues, I think warning is probably the right term to use, that Prozac is not just another antidepressant. And he tells the story, and I think this is the one that you want me to tell, of one of his patients who he calls Tess. Now, Tess is the kind of person that you would imagine would be a prime candidate for years of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. She'd grown up in had a very abusive childhood. She had an alcoholic father, a depressed mother. She had to raise her 9 siblings by herself. She had, achieved remarkable things professionally, but her personal life was a mess. One abusive relationship after another. She comes to Peter Kramer, and after trying her out on the older tricyclics, Prozac has recently been introduced. He thinks he's going to try her on Prozac, and she comes back and she says, it's as if I'm clear-headed for the very first time. As if, not just that she was feeling depressed when she came in, but this wasn't just about my depression has lifted. It's like I've become the person I was always meant to be. And he, in my mind, I imagine he sort of cocks an eye and he follows this. What happens is that she, after several months, no longer meets the diagnostic criteria for depression. She's not depressed anymore. She goes off Prozac, therefore. And she's doing okay, but after a few months, she gets back in touch with Kramer and she says, I want the drug again. I want that edge again. Stuff is heating up at work. I've got some really tricky negotiations. I miss feeling like that me that I was on that drug. And he thinks about this, and he writes her the prescription. And in a line that becomes very widely cited, he says, who was I to withhold from her the bounties of science?
Is there anything wrong with that?
Yes, good question. So that becomes the debate. So what if Tess had become this person, this better than person she'd ever been, through years of hard psychotherapy, working hard in psychotherapy over many years, and she turned to that person, no one would be bothered.
But popping a pill...
She'd earned it.
Yeah.
But popping a pill and getting it for free and doing a kind of chemical quick fix struck people as troubling. But not only because it was too easy, but also because it raised the prospect of psychiatrists prescribing drugs for lifestyle reasons rather than medical reasons. Now, to be really clear, they've been doing this for years. The whole Valium scene back in the 50s and 60s, people who took Valium weren't suffering, no one thought they were suffering from anything other than sort of angst or boredom or concerns, problems at the office, and they'd pop their Valium, and people were happy to prescribe that. But because Prozac had been had been brought onto the market as a specific treatment for a specific disease, and it was also a different era, people worried. I don't know if there's something wrong with that. That's the debate.
In your view, what do you think about the efforts to get rid of the stigma that comes with a diagnosis of mental illness and meds prescribed?
So what are the efforts to get rid of the stigma? The original hope was that actually going biological would reduce stigma, because mental illness would be understood to be just a disease just like any other. It's no different from having any, diabetes. You have diabetes, I have schizophrenia, we both have a disease. And the hope was therefore that people would understand that, medicine can look after both of these populations, and they're just people. It's turned out to be a little bit more tricky. The idea that going biological reduced stigma has been a mixed, produced mixed results. Because if you tell someone that, this person you're going to work with in your office has a brain disorder called schizophrenia, some of the studies that have sort of tried the experiment have shown that this leads people to kind of want to keep their distance. It creates anxiety. If you tell them, but it's very well treated, and so on, that might, then stigma, then people are more apt to be open about it. What tends to make the biggest difference, I think, to reduce stigma is exposure. One of the things I do in to real people, and humanizing. So one of the things I do in a big undergraduate lecture class that I sometimes teach is I'm sometimes fortunate enough to persuade a woman I really admire named Ellen Sachs to come onto Skype and spend an evening taking questions from the students. Ellen Sachs suffers from schizophrenia. She's also a law professor in California. and she's written a wonderful memoir called The Center Cannot Hold. And she comes on, they read the memoir, and then they see her. And she talks about her illness, but above all, she's a person. So I think, the efforts to reduce stigma are, it's about connecting.
These stories and more in Mind Fixers, Psychiatry's troubled search for the biology of mental illness. Anne Harrington, we're grateful you made the trip up from Harvard to spend some time with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.